In the early 1950s, cats started dancing in the city of Minamata, located on the shore of the bay of the same name in southern Japan. This is not a story about some Shinto miracle. At first, the animals had a wobbling gait, they stumbled as if dancing. After a while, convulsions and death set in. It's not that no one paid attention to it, they just didn't pay much attention. You never know what causes strays to die, until the same symptoms appeared in people. The first to be admitted to the hospital on April 21, 1956, was a 5-year-old girl with symptoms of nervous system damage. The little girl had difficulty speaking, could barely stand on her feet, and her body was periodically shaken by convulsions. 2 days later, her younger sister was admitted to the clinic with the same symptoms. The girl's mother told doctors that the neighbor's daughter was also sick. Doctors went house by house throughout the entire neighborhood and found 8 more sick people. On May 1st, the hospital director was forced to report to the local health department about the beginning of an epidemic of an unknown disease of the central nervous system, which was later called Minamata disease. The city government established the Kibyo Taisaku Einkai, literally the Strange Disease Countermeasure Committee. Hypotheses began to emerge. At first, because the sick people lived in the neighborhood, it was assumed that the disease was contagious. The patients were quarantined and their homes were disinfected. It soon became clear that microbes and viruses had nothing to do with it, but for those afflicted with Minamata disease it was too late. They became shunned and feared. However, during these useless events, important circumstances emerged. Locals told doctors about the dancing cats, and upon detailed questioning it turned out that they were not the first victims of the disease. Birds had been dying in this area for several years, and fish were floating upside down. The disaster was taking on new dimensions before our eyes. A group of researchers from Kumamoto National University went to Minamata. By October 1956, 40 cases of the disease had been registered, 14 patients, 35% of those affected, had fallen into a coma and died. Researchers were struggling to find the cause of the disease. The picture was strange. Minamata disease always began suddenly. No fever, no feeling unwell. The first symptoms described by patients and their relatives were numbness in the fingers. For example, patients noticed that they could not pick up a small object from the table because they could not feel it. Then problems with movement and swallowing began, the voice acquired a high timbre, vision and hearing deteriorated. The researchers found something else the patients had in common, beyond their symptoms. They all lived in fishing villages along the coast of Minamata Bay, and their daily diet, like that of the local cats, included fish and shellfish caught in the bay. What could it be in food that affected the nervous systems of different species in the same way? On November 4, 1956, the research team published their initial findings. Minamata disease was caused by heavy metal poisoning from fish, and therefore from the waters of the bay. Suspicion immediately fell on the wastewater from the local city-forming enterprise, the Chisso plant, which produced fertilizers and chemical reagents, acetylene, acetic aldehyde, acetic acid, etc. Environmental responsibility was not yet in fashion at the time, and the plant dumped its waste directly into Hyakan Bay, which was connected to the sea. Tests showed that the plant's wastewater contained almost the entire middle of the periodic table: manganese, copper, arsenic, thallium, selenium. But what exactly caused the mass poisoning? Maybe manganese? The symptoms of poisoning with it are similar to Parkinson's disease, and those who suffered from Minamata disease had uncontrolled movements. However, British neurologist Douglas McAlpine, one of the pioneers of multiple sclerosis research, who visited Minamata in March 1958, pointed out that the symptoms of the disease were very similar to poisoning by organic mercury compounds. The researchers began looking for mercury and were horrified. It wasn't just the fish in Minamata Bay that were saturated with mercury. There were 2 kilograms of mercury for every ton of sediment covering the bottom. enough to extract it directly from the sand and silt industrially. We must give credit to the resourcefulness of Chisso's managers. They later did just that. They founded a subsidiary to extract mercury from the bay. Hair samples were taken from sick people and their neighbors for analysis. Those who showed symptoms of the disease had mercury levels in their hair as high as 705 ppm, parts per million. Those who did not show symptoms but lived near the bay had levels of about 191 ppm. The average mercury level in human hair is 4 ppm. The concentration of mercury compounds in the water increased sharply in the direction from the bay along Hyakan Bay. The mercury trail definitely led to the source of the pollution, the Chisso plant. However, instead of taking measures to protect people, the company decided to protect itself. When researchers from Kumamoto University announced their findings, Chisso locked the gates and refused to even provide information about what exactly it was producing and by what methods. This is one of the reasons why the investigation dragged on for 2 years. But scientists and doctors were able to reconstruct the picture of what happened. The symptoms of Minamata disease did not fully correspond to poisoning by metallic mercury, Hg0, or its inorganic compounds, for example, chloride or sulfate, HgCl2, HgSO4, Hg2SO4. Chronic poisoning usually begins with headaches, general weakness, drowsiness, and acute mercury vapor, is accompanied by vomiting, diarrhea, and bleeding gums. Therefore, suspicion fell on organic mercury compounds, many of which are neurotoxins. The Chisso plant produced acetic aldehyde, CH3CHO. The method is described in any chemistry textbook. This is the so-called Kusharov reaction. At a temperature of 90 to 95 degrees Celsius, a water molecule is added to the acetylene molecule CH equals CH, breaking its double bond. Mercury sulfate, Hg2SO4, serves as a catalyst in the reaction. The mercury ion Hg2+ is inserted into the double bond of acetylene, making it possible to add water. In theory, the mercury is then detached, and mercury and acetic aldehyde are obtained separately at the output. But in practice, the reaction does not proceed cleanly. Some mercury does not leave the hydrocarbon molecules, and the byproduct of the Kusharov reaction is methylmercury, CH3Hg+. This is a positively charged ion radical. Even if you did not understand anything from the previous paragraph, you have probably heard about radicals. Radicals are very active and love to enter into chemical reactions with other substances. For methylmercury in the body, the main victim is the thiol group, SH, which is part of the amino acid cysteine. By the way, thiols got their old name, mercaptans, precisely for their ability to capture mercury, English mercury capture. Cysteine is a component of protein enzymes, including digestive and toxin-neutralizing ones, and most importantly, many proteins maintain their shape and structure precisely due to bridges of thiol groups of cysteine. We kill the thiol group. The protein changes shape and can no longer do its job. In addition, it is the ability to bind to cysteine that makes methylmercury especially dangerous for the nervous system. Having sat on the tail of the amino acid, the toxin easily passes along with it through the blood-brain barrier, a filter installed in the vessels of the brain and usually protecting it from toxic substances and aggression from the immune system. Therefore, the symptoms of damage to the nervous system in the residents of Minamata were much more pronounced than is usually the case with mercury poisoning. Methylmercury has another dangerous property, the ability to bioaccumulate. Of all mercury compounds, it penetrates body tissues more easily than any other, and is excreted slowly. Therefore, in predatory fish and filter-feeding organisms, such as mussels and oysters, the level of methylmercury increases dozens of times compared to its amount in water, plankton, or small fish. Fish in Minamata Bay contained an average of 15 μg, 1/1,000,000 of a gram, of mercury per gram of weight, and mollusks, all 178 μg. For ordinary sea fish and mollusks, the maximum is 1.5 and 0.75 μg/g. It was these poisoned mollusks and large fish that ended up on the tables of fishermen and their families. In humans, the process continued. The half-life of methylmercury in the body of an adult is 65 to 70 days, and contaminated fish was eaten every day in the city. The toxin accumulated in the tissues until the nervous system gave in. The number of sick people continued to grow, and the behavior of the Chisso management left much to be desired. Its next step was to change the location of the wastewater discharge. Apparently, the researchers with test tubes, running around Hyakan Bay and collecting samples, were quite annoying to the businessmen. And in September 1958, instead of the bay, the wastewater began to be discharged directly into the Minamata River, which flows into the sea just north of the bay. Fish immediately died at the mouth of the river, and cases of methylmercury poisoning began to appear in other parts of the Shiranui Sea coast. Today, in the current situation, Minamata would already be flooded with foreign journalists and environmental activists. The factory would be surrounded by protest banners. Chisso shares would have crashed on the stock exchange, and the news would have reported on the shaky rate of the Japanese yen. But 1968 was still a long way off. The students who, during international protests 10 years later, began to talk around the world not only about anti-militarism and free love, but also about protecting the environment, were still walking hand in hand with their mothers. The world lives, if not under sub-communism, then under capitalism of the wildest kind, where only those with money matter. The Minamata tragedy unfolded in complete silence. No reporters, no outraged public. Moreover, people who fell ill continued to be discriminated against. Not because someone was afraid of getting infected. Chisso provided up to a quarter of the city's jobs, and the plant itself paid half of the local taxes. The company was supported by the Ministry of International Trade and the Japan Chemical Industry Association. So the victims of Minamata disease were now being vilified by their own neighbors and friends for the fact that because of them the city's economy was falling apart. And also the largest case of blaming the victim in history. The fishermen saved the situation. Not the families who suffered, but those who continued to fish in the bay. Chisso had paid them off twice before when the catch in the bay had fallen, in 1926 and 1943. But this time there were almost no fish left in the bay. Their catch had fallen by 91%. On August 6, 1959, angry fishermen came to the gates of the Chisso plant to demand compensation. They returned again on August 12. On October 17, the Minamata fishermen were joined by those who had lost their catch when the plant changed the discharge point. Having received no response, the Fishermen's Cooperative appealed to Tokyo and managed to get a delegation from the Diet to come to Minamata. On November 2, at the same time as the parliamentarians were visiting, protesters broke into the plant, causing 10 million yen, about $100,000, worth of damage. The uprising was widely covered on Japanese television, drawing attention to what was happening in Minamata. Chisso settled. On December 17, an agreement was signed that gave the fishermen 17 million yen in one lump sum payments and established a 65 million yen fund to gradually cover their losses. Those who suffered from Minamata disease were still too intimidated to take direct action. After the November events, they approached Kumamoto Prefecture, the regional government, to have their compensation request considered along with the fishermen's demands. Chisso eventually agreed. Patients who were officially registered as having suffered from methylmercury poisoning were awarded annual payments of 100,000 yen, $917, and children were awarded 30,000 yen, $275. Families of the deceased received a one-time payment of 320,000 yen, $2,935. By 2001, 2,265 people had been declared victims of Minamata disease. In total, 17,000 people had claimed this status. This figure should not be surprising. Chisso continued to increase its production of acetaldehyde after the incident, reaching a record high of 45,245 tons per year by 1960. The plant changed its production method only in 1968. In 1959, just after Minamata had gained media attention, Chisso installed a cyclator purification unit on its chimney. Company President Kiichi Yoshioka ceremoniously cut the ribbon at its launch on October 21st and drank a glass of purified water. It later turned out that the cyclator had not yet been installed that day, and the water he drank was tap water, not part of the plant's wastewater. 6 years later, when a similar outbreak occurred in Niigata Prefecture in Japan, this time at the fault of a different chemical company, an independent examination found that cyclator-type devices did not remove organic mercury compounds from water at all. Chisso continues to compensate victims to this day. In Minamata Bay since the 1960s, a coastal reclamation program has been underway. Most of the coastal soil and bottom sediments, where mercury concentrations exceeded 25 ppm, were removed. New soil was brought in to replace them. As a result, the bay has decreased in area by 58 hectares. There is now an eco-park there, and nearby is the Minamata Disease Museum with a memorial. In 1974, barrier nets were stretched between Minamata Bay and the rest of the sea to prevent contaminated fish from escaping into other parts of the coastal waters and being caught by fishermen. In 1994, an examination showed that the mercury content in Minamata Bay fish did not exceed the national standards of 0.4 ppm total mercury and 0.3 ppm methylmercury. Trace amounts of methylmercury are always found in fish, since some mercury is methylated directly in organisms, binding to organic molecules. In July 1997, the head of Kumamoto Prefecture declared that the bay was no longer any different from the surrounding sea and was safe for people. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more little-known scary stories from real life, subscribe to the channel. Good luck.